great to see everybody, and a very warm welcome from the Housing LIN to this happy hour, the 1st of October, which for those of you who don't know is also United Nations Day for International Day for Older Persons. So we're really delighted to be able to host this and look at specifically around issues around ageism and issues around that, what the implications are for our homes and for our life course. And to help us today, we've got 3 excellent speakers, and I'll come on to them in a minute. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background, because for those of you who've known the Housing LIN for a long time, we often hold and host both conferences and events, and have done those in person. But obviously with COVID, we've had to move to an online presence and develop a digital platform. And the happy hour has really taken off over the last 4 or 5 weeks, and these are really popular events. In fact, so much so that we're going to increase the ability to hold both more of those, but also invite more people to join them every week and just watch this space. But also, the Housing LIN was born out of time when we were in the Department of Health. And over 10 years ago, there was a national service framework for older people. And standard one of that was really rooting out age discrimination. It very much applied to age discrimination in the NHS and social care, but it also applied to places where care was being delivered. So that could have been in a housing setting, such as extra care housing. But I think sort of more recently, organisations like the Equalities of Human Rights Commission have shown some of the challenges around supporting older and disabled people in the housing, and the types of choices that they have, but more fundamentally, the types of rights they have. And I think this session is going to be looking at both the challenges around an ageing population, but also how we look at what we mean around our homes, our environments, and how can we help root out ageism in the long run. So we're joined today by 3 most eminent speakers. So our first round at this bar is going to be with Professor Sarah Harford from the University of Oxford, and I'm really delighted that you can join us and talk about a new agenda for ageing. She will be followed by Professor Tom Sharp from Newcastle University, and then we'll be followed by Jordan Giverson from Guild Living, because this week is also the launch of a really important campaign called Stop Ageism. We've got 3 excellent speakers. I know you all want to hear them talk. So without further ado, Sarah, can I welcome you to the bar?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me to this event. I didn't know about it beforehand, but having seen what you do, we've now got as many people as possible from our world to come on, because I just think it seems a very, very exciting opportunity to be able to discuss this. Now, what Jeremy asked me to do was really to give a sort of general overview. And as he said, it is the International Day of Older People, and we're also looking at the Stop Ageism campaign. So my title, and I've got some slides, I'll put them up in a minute, is actually, do we need a new agenda? There has been a lot of talk about the way that we have viewed older people, the way that older people have been treated in this COVID situation. And some people are suggesting that there is an increase in ageism and we therefore need a new agenda. And I just want to take you through some of those ideas and then lead you into some work we're doing at Oxford, where we think we can sort of contribute to trying to reduce ageism. So I'm now going to share some slides with you. I'm going to stop my video, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Wait a sec. Okay. So, ageism post-COVID, do we need a new agenda? I think it's very, very clear that there has been tremendous concern about potential ageism. And I think the really big question is, has something like COVID increased ageism in our society, or has it just highlighted ageism? We know that there's been a huge amount of work done around ageism over the last 20, 30 years, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We know that we have age discrimination legislation. Is it fit for purpose in the world that we now live in? We also know that the human rights approach has very much engaged with the whole ageism question. So I just want to take you through some of those ideas. And one of the things I hope we can have in the discussion is, has COVID increased ageism, or has it just highlighted ageism? So the really important thing, I think, is to understand the difference between direct ageism and indirect ageism. I'm just sharing this. This is seen by gerontologists as one of the first academic papers. Bob Butler was very keen that we should connect particularly with older adults. And he very much distinguished between what he called direct ageism, and that is where we specifically will discriminate or stereotype older adults because they're old, and indirect ageism. And I think probably it's the latter that nowadays we tend to see more of, where something will occur and sort of almost incidentally older adults are affected. And one of the things I will talk about a little bit towards the end, of course, is what happened with COVID in our care homes, because some people do argue that that was direct ageism, but many people suggest that we are in a society where, without even thinking about it, we have indirect ageism. People sort of forgot older adults. They didn't seem to be important at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. However, we actually have a second form, and that's the way that over the years we have been able to, if you like, have a legal framework, and that's around age discrimination and the Equality Act. And throughout the EU, and in fact in many other, particularly high-income countries, but we're also finding it in lower and middle-income countries, where actually discrimination on grounds of age is being put into a legal framework. And I just wanted to share this with you. This comes from the Age UK website, but I think it's a really nice description about age discrimination, and they identify between direct discrimination. In other words, you are directly discriminated, and the example they give is you can't join a gym because of your age. Indirect discrimination, and that's when a good or service is discriminatory against you, but it's very much in an indirect fashion. For example, some people say mortgages are actually indirect discrimination because they stop at 70 to 75 rather than direct discrimination because it's done on a financial calculation rather than an age calculation. And then things like harassment and victimization. So very clearly in this country over the last 30 years, we have seen ageism being tackled through the Age Discrimination and Equality Acts, although many people argue that this framework is not as effective as it possibly should be. And then recently we've had a huge push around the human rights agenda and bringing age discrimination and ageism into that agenda. And I have to thank Sasha Sidorenko for putting these slides for me. He has worked in this area for a long time. And here we have, from 1982 onwards, we have the United Nations frameworks on aging, really engaging with human rights and ageism, and right the way through to the Sustainable Development Goals. And indeed, you can see a variety of organizations, many UN organizations, WHO, ILO, Habitat, etc., have actually bought into ageism and human rights, and also many civil organizations. And you can just see I've lit them up there, just for example, the Age Platform Europe, Help Age International, for example. However, there has been a big debate, which I think is relevant. There is a group who argue that actually we should not have specific human rights action for older adults, because that in a way excludes them from mainstream adulthood, and we should therefore ensure that all human rights take into account some of the needs and factors which would affect older people as well as younger people. And then there's another group which say that no, just as we have specific human rights legislation and action for children and women, so we need it for older adults. But in the General Assembly in 2017, they, despite actually about a decade of discussing this, it was decided that no, we not at the moment develop an internationally legal binding instrument specifically devoted to the rights of older persons. But I think it's a really interesting debate, and one can see aspects on both sides. Would it promote age discrimination or actually help the case of age discrimination? So one of the really interesting questions I think we should be able to discuss is, has COVID made ageism worse? I think, as I said, there has been a huge amount of sort of public discourse in the press, in particular, about the way that older people have been excluded from mainstream society. As we know, there is actually a big debate at the moment, which Oxford scientists are involved in. Some of my colleagues in the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine are arguing that actually maybe we should segregate vulnerable older people and just keep them segregated and let the rest of us come back into the economy and live our lives in the most normal way we can. And then other colleagues led particularly by Trish Greenlay, who is a medical scientist at Oxford, has argued that no, we're all in this together. So has COVID made ageism worse? I think a very clear thing is that we've actually learned a lot about the position of older people. Without any doubt, we have learned that age is very complex when it comes to the pandemic. And although, like seasonal flu, COVID appears to follow the age pattern of all mortality risk, we also know that, in fact, younger people are being affected. And we have, in fact, a lot of publicity this week in particular about the long haulers. So age is complex. And we know, of course, that men are more impacted than women, that chronic conditions, including obesity, make you more vulnerable. And we also increasingly are understanding about ethnicity and race. So the idea that age and older people are in some way different when it comes to the pandemic, I think is now being questioned. We, as I say, have had a big debate about the vulnerability of care homes. And it does really see that not only in this country, I mean, I know people in the UK actually feel very guilty about what happened in our care homes. But if you look across Europe, for example, many, many countries acted in the same way. In particular, the UK guidance of hospital discharge and dispatch to care homes was incredibly weak at the beginning of the pandemic. There were no specific guidelines. We know that there was a lack of testing and PPE. And we also know that the use of agency workers within our care homes very sadly led to the spread of the pandemic between care homes and the community. And I think that is a real question. Is that because that was direct ageism? Or more likely, is it the fact that we live in a very ageist society, but it's indirect ageism? And there's also some very interesting work happening on the third point on the slide around older adults and vaccination. And I think this has been a very rewarding area to work in because we know that older people tend to have a lower response to vaccinations. We know they tend not to be involved in trials for vaccinations. And yet it is very, very clear that they have been put right to the top of the agenda, and both in the development of the vaccination, the way we deliver the vaccination, and the ordering in which people will be vaccinated, older adults are really at the front of this. So I think that has revealed a very positive view of older people within our society. The other two, less so. So how did we get here? I want to sort of conclude this by specifically looking at some academic research about why we have such an ageist society, whether it's direct or indirect, and what we can do about it. And this links into some work that we have been doing at Oxford around age segregation. So basically, we've known for a long time that one of the problems with growing older and being old is that older people tend to fall into that category of the other. And there is a huge history of social science research from psychology, sociology, anthropology, which really highlights how mainstream society can treat those who are not in our group as the other. So psychology has long pointed out that we have an in-group and an other group. Sociology has a concept particularly around otherness, in which the dominant in-group, that's us, constructs out-groups, which tend to be older people. And from anthropology, we have a lot of literature about how we tend to objectify humans who are not us into things, and the other becomes the one thing. So all older people who are not us, therefore, become the same. And this literature very much entered into the field of gerontology, and we've had a long history of understanding the role of age segregation, the other, and ageism. And I just want to highlight two sort of very influential pieces of work, one in the States by Hagestad and Uhlenberg in 2005, who in a very influential article wrote about the social separation of young and old people, and that this was, they believed, the root of ageism. In other words, that if you have a concept of the other and then you socially and physically separate those groups, then it is almost inevitable, they argue, that isms, in this case an ageism, will occur. And our own Bill, by the way, as long ago as 1995, in his book around age discrimination, talked separately or together, ageism and age segregation mark sharp distinctions between us and them. And in particular, the old who are discriminated against are seen as occupying a different territory from us, the mainstream. So one of the things that we've been working a lot at Oxford is taking the idea of the other, taking ideas around age segregation, and we have a long history of work around intergenerational work. And I know Tom also is maybe going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, because he also has great expertise in this area. And we are working particularly through the Design Age Institute, which is a new institute which is shared between the Royal College of Art, where it is based under the research PI of Jeremy Marson, Oxford and Newcastle, where we are trying to contribute to that debate of building intergenerational communities as a way of getting away from age segregation and therefore, we hope, ageism and age discrimination. So the argument here is that if we can have a good interaction between the generations, we now have very strong scientific evidence that interaction between generations improves well-being and mental health for both young and old, which is really important. This isn't just about old people, it's about the health of our society in general. That intergenerational living promotes healthy aging through increasing physical and mental well-being and reducing loneliness, and that intergenerational communities, that in intergenerational communities, relationships are built around exchange of resources between people, where each member, young and old, feels that they need the others and that they in turn are needed by them. So it's a very promotion of sort of well-being and empowerment of both young and old people in these communities. And we argue that we need it particularly now. I'm sure many of you were actually shocked by the revelations of older adults isolated physically in housing where they were found to have died, sometimes days or weeks after they died. I think COVID has also highlighted that many families are able to care and support older relatives, but this is not possible in our society for all older adults. And in particular, I think the fact that we're talking in the public discourse around COVID and older adults and discrimination and ageism at least means that this is now something that people are considering. So this is just a general overview of why we believe one way in, actually, I'm just going to stop sharing my, and put myself back up. So this is just a really sort of a very quick overview of age discrimination, ageism, how we believe segregation of the generations has been so detrimental, and how it's really important to engage with the housing community, with designers and architects, to really start thinking about building these intergenerational communities, which will address clearly still a scourge of our society, and that is ageism and age discrimination. Thank you.
Sarah, that was great. I know I asked you to put a lot in the 15 minutes, and you certainly have. And I think, certainly there's been some questions in the chat room and some comments as well. And I was struck by some of the things you were talking about in terms of the different sort of approaches. And it feels to me that what you sort of described is very much sort of like, how can we regenerate a social model of aging as well, and thinking about that. And I like the bit that you touched on around intergenerational. I hope we can come back to that later. It's something that the LIN has been very keen to explore, as you know, with you and others, through a term we've coined collaborage, age being aging as opposed to age is older person. So a collaborative approach to this. But I'm not going to steal any Tom's thunder, because I'm sure he's going to look a little bit more at sort of the role of home and the meaning of home. So without further ado, we'll come back to some of the questions. Tom, really delighted that you could join us as well. So over to you, mate.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Jeremy, and also thanks, Sarah, for setting the scene so well. And I don't think there's an excessive amount of overlap between what you've said and what I'd like to say. So I really wanted to focus much more in my short presentation on home, meanings of home, but also then to link this into debates around ageism and to connect ageism to ideas around housing and home. Because I think, as Sarah's clearly said, is that the experience of COVID has revealed that sort of general institutionalized form of ageism that characterizes our societies. But it's also linked those sort of general discussions about ageism to a much narrower set of discussions about and assumptions about where and how older people live and where and how older people should live. So key questions here around whether people are living in appropriate or inappropriate housing, whether people are over-occupying housing with decent sized sort of gardens and good space, the focus on the relative merits, benefits of moving as opposed to staying put. And then the sort of wider connection, so Sarah was talking about intergenerational forms of living, but there's also that other intergenerational dimension, which has been there through the sort of Brexit debates about whether older people are preventing younger people from accessing the housing market and developing their own trajectories through the housing system. So for me, these are connected to those sort of ageist assumptions about where and how people should spend their later years. And what I wanted to do really in this presentation was try and connect that to what we know about home and the meanings of home in later life as a way of challenging some of those assumptions and stereotypes. So we know, and it's been highlighted through COVID, is that where we live, the communities in which we live, have a really major impact on well-being. And we know that good housing, features of good housing, have strong impact on, are important for well-being, but also that we need to maybe differentiate housing from home in some ways. So good houses don't necessarily lead to good homes, and poor houses don't necessarily lead to poor homes. So much depends on an understanding of what we mean by home. And this comes back to sort of a long tradition in environmental gerontology that points to the importance of place in older people's lives, that as people age, the argument is that the places in which they live, the spaces they inhabit, become much more important as they progress. And as people's lives are lengthened, right? We have growing numbers of people in their 90s, growing numbers of centenarians, as the most recent ONS data have shown, is that we need to think about evolving understandings of home across a much longer life. So how one understands home in one's 60s and 70s may well be different to understandings of home you know, once you pass 100, once you pass 105. So home is important in terms of quality of life, in terms of its physical appearance, the social relationships associated with home settings, feelings of safety within and beyond the home, the way in which we can access services and amenities. But we also know from work on the environments of aging that home itself is multidimensional and incredibly complex. And I've been drawn over the years very much to the work of social geographers, people like Graham Rolls at the University of Kentucky, who has done a lot of work on the multidimensional nature of home and on, you know, the different meanings that attach to home. And what he describes is home as being territory, a place of possession and ownership that may be fiercely defended. He says that home's a place of safety and security, the spatial fulcrum of our life, a place of centering that may become the core of our being, a location from which we venture forth into a potentially hostile world outside, and so on. Now, this is deliberately an idealized version of home, right? That is, you know, that home also has an ambiguous aspect, and that home may be associated with negative connotations. But from that type perspective that's developed by Graham Rolls, and I think I would align myself to that, is that if these dimensions of home aren't in place, then effectively people are homeless, right? They may have a home, they may have housing, four walls in which they live, but it isn't home. So the argument there is, unless people can achieve that, you know, those different dimensions of home, is that they are effectively without a home. They don't have a home. And this really came to the fore in work that I did during my time in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, when I was at NUI Galway. We had the opportunity to bring Graham Rolls over from the United States, and with Kieran Walsh, we conducted an empirical project in different rural communities in Ireland. And we sort of developed, focusing on sort of the way in which people's attachment to home evolves over the course of a long life. We developed this idea, which we called at oneness, but we're open to discussions about whether that's the right label or not. But the basic idea here is the way in which people's sense of home evolves over time in alignment with the wider community, the wider context in which their lives unfold. And we developed this idea of at oneness as having 6 different dimensions. And what was really insightful, I think, was that this work was generated out of interviews that we did with older people who were lifelong residents of a particular small community in the west of Ireland. Right? So these are unusual individuals who for 70, 80 years had lived in the same community, whose from the outside you would have expected that their lives had not changed very much, but actually, thinking across the sweep of their lives, everything had changed. Their homes had changed, the community in which they were living had changed, the broader societal context had changed. So the question there is, how do people make and remake that sense of home and belonging over the course of a life? And we thought that these individuals, these unusual individuals who'd lived in the same place for decades, that there were lessons to be learned from those individuals that could be shared more widely across people living in other types of communities. And there were really 6 aspects of this sense of oneness that were more or less important for different individuals, some of which have bearing, I think, more generally. So one aspect was the place of origin, that sense of nativity, right? That you're aging in a place that you were born in and raised in, felt the sense of attachment to over the course of a longer life. So that speaks to individuals' sense of identity and belonging. Linked to that are also these the meanings attached to being in place at home. So that continuity across generations, maybe through inheritance of property, artifacts that are passed down from one generation to the next, the rose bush that's planted in your front garden by your grandmother that is still there, still flowering through the summer, that connects you to that place. There are also a third dimension of the rhythms and routines associated with daily life. So people would talk about the habits that had formed within place, in sort of married, in couple relationships, or even individually, the sort of types of rhythms and routines that if those routines were disrupted in any way, that would really set people back. And if you get out of the wrong side of the bed in the morning, you're not right for the rest of the day until sort of evening, and you get a chance to recover from that experience. Or if sharp words are said over the cup of tea in the morning, that might disrupt you for 2 or 3 days until you sort of re-establish that sense of balance and back into the established routine. A fourth dimension speaks to that in the sense of an idea of relational harmonies. So this speaks to the quality of relationships within that small environment of the home, but also reflected in the wider environment of community, is that people's sense of home is strongly associated with the relationships both within the home, but then more broadly. So we found examples of individuals who would, deliberately be leaving their home at a particular time of the day because they knew the neighbour would be passing in the car and might offer to pick them up to take them into the village or the next town to do some shopping, to go to the post office to sort out some of their financial affairs. And this is based on that negotiation of relationships with family, with friends, with neighbours that goes on in communities. In the west coast of Ireland, but also in other parts of the world, I think the natural surroundings play a really important part in terms of people's sense of identity and belonging. And so people in the west, in the small rural community in the west of Ireland, would, that seemingly was unchanged, would talk about the way in which particular fields, particular parts, features of the natural environment had evolved over the course of their lives, that there was either more or less natural fauna and flora over time. But you see that also in parts of the industrialized northeast, that people can be very attached to the post-industrial urban landscape because it's associated with particular memories and sense of belonging. And the final dimension of this at oneness was that sense of an invested effort, the physical, the economic, the emotional effort that's been invested over time to create a sense of home, which is important in terms of self-identity and belonging. So I think bring this sort of to an end for now, is what this really shows is that the relative dimensions of home and of belonging, what we refer to as oneness, will differ across individuals and differ across social groups. So some people may be attached to home because of the sense of that investment of effort in creating home and creating community. Others may feel that they belong much more because it's a place in which they were born and have grown up, but they may be less attached to the rhythms and routines of daily life. They may have, so those aspects will differ between people and also differ over time. And I think crucially, over an extended life course, I think what our data show and what is backed up in other studies is how adaptable older people are to the changing personal environmental context of life. So many of those ageist assumptions about older people being incapable of making decisions, of needing the sort of rational decision to leave a home that seems to be unsuited to their personal health or care needs, that really that underestimates the adaptability of many older people to deal with the environmental conditions in which they live. And what's really important here is, when policy planning decision makers jump to those conclusions about where people should live, how they should spend their later years, it essentially is just that is reveals that sort of deep-seated ageism that suggests that older people are vulnerable to the environments in which they live, and that it would be better for them and it would be better for society as a whole if they were removed from them, without then recognizing the emotional attachments that people display to their homes, sometimes the willingness to tolerate what many people would regard as poor housing conditions, but for people, these are associated with meanings and the sense of belonging. So I think we need to do much more to counteract those age-based stereotypes and focus on supporting people to make and remake home over the course of extended lives. So that's essentially how I've tried to connect this data about ageism to an understanding of home, neighborhood, belonging. So thanks for listening. Looking forward to the discussion.
Tom, thank you very much. That was really illuminating, and you certainly got my thought buds pumping. Some of the things you talked about, belonging, things that I remember Professor Judith Torrington at Sheffield University talking about in terms of how do we create the spirituality of home to cope with the longing and belonging and the meaning of being there. So again, I was very struck by that, as well as you touched on the rhythms of life as well. I don't know if you know the work of Dean Hawkes at Cambridge University, who's looked at the circadian models of building, how you look at the facilities through natural light, ventilation, south-facing, acoustics, warmth, all those sort of things which provide comfort to people as well. So some really interesting things you've just sparked in my mind, and I hope we can follow on in terms of the discussion as we continue. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jordan. Jordan Giberson from Guild Living. Guild Living are a retirement living provider, an operator. They have some really ambitions to look at how to grow both the choices available, but also to underpin this with the Stop Ageism campaign. So Jordan, I'm going to pass over to you and I'm going to log off.
Amazing. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jeremy. So yeah, my name is Jordan Giberson from Guild Living. So just want to take a second. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for offering to allow me to have a little bit of time to discuss the Stop Ageism campaign today with everyone. So thought it might be helpful just to give a quick overview of Guild Living and who we are as a company, really just to help connect the dots about the Stop Ageism campaign and kind of how that came about. So Guild Living, essentially, our mission is really to reinstate older people at the heart of our lives and communities. So that's really what we're all about. But just as a quick overview, essentially, we are building later living communities in town centers. So right now we have 4 locations. We have one in Bath, Epsom, Walton-on-Thames, and Uxbridge. So all of these are later living communities in the heart of town centers so that older people can stay connected with all the amenities and everything that town centers really have to offer. And they're also built to help facilitate intergenerational activities for people. And then just a couple of other quick overview items for Guild Living is that we're very academically led. So we're doing a big research study with the University of Bath on loneliness right now. Not sure if anybody is aware of that, but we're actually planning on revealing some of those findings coming up soon, I think sometime this autumn. So you'll have to be on the lookout for that. Very excited for that. And then we're also fully funded by Legal in General. So we work very closely with them. But really wanted to take this time to talk about the Stop Ageism campaign and how that came about and what that looks like. So like I said, our mission is to reinstate older people at the heart of our lives and communities. So that's what we're really all about, is making older people's lives better. And something that we notice is that there's still a lot of ageism that's prevalent in our society. And we feel like it's really the last living ism that's still widely accepted, and that we feel that there's that people don't really realize, some people don't really realize that this is an issue. And we've also realized that there's a lot of organizations doing really great work in this space and who have been doing work for years and years, but thought that it might be nice to develop a platform for everyone to share their ideas about ageism on, to all gather together. Because while Guild Living is very passionate about this and making a difference in older people's lives, you know, us alone, we won't make nearly as big of a difference as if we have multiple voices and organizations all saying the same thing. That's where we're really going to make a difference. So really the whole goal of the campaign is to gather a wide variety of organizations to all join in and be saying the same thing to fight ageism. So we've gathered organizations from really large corporate organizations to smaller companies, to charities of, you know, big size, small size, to photographers, and looking at bloggers, and really trying to get a wide variety of organizations and industries all involved in this campaign. So that's essentially what it is a platform for everyone to share their ideas on. So not at all meant to be the Guild Living show at all. It's really meant to be a platform, and we're really here to help facilitate and manage and move things forward for the campaign. So essentially for the campaign, we've broken it out into 3 different areas. So the first one is language. So tackling the everyday ageist language that we have towards one another. And the second area is cities. So making our cities more accessible and age friendly. And then the third one is services. So looking at things that help promote independence for longer through areas such as financial areas, technology, and things like that. So essentially for the campaign, like I said, it's really partner run. So these are just some of the organizations that we've gathered thus far that have decided to become a part of the organization or become a part of the campaign. I think a couple of them might actually be on this call. So shout out to the partners if you're on this call. But yes, this is just some of the partners that have decided to join us, and really want to give a quick overview of what that looks like to become a partner. So if you said, yeah, I'm really interested in becoming a part of this, the first step that we do is to develop a partner page for each of our partners. So for Legal in General, for example, they'd have their own partner page with a description of their organization and a link that goes out to their site. And that was really the first phase of the campaign, was to get organizations involved to say, yes, we'd love to be a part of this. And our goal was 20. We hit that a few weeks back, which is really exciting. And it's continuously growing. This isn't even all the organizations that have signed up yet so far. So it's really exciting. But that's the first phase, is just getting partners involved. And like Jeremy mentioned before, we actually just launched this campaign on the 28th, which was 2 days ago. So really excited to get this up and running and start developing content. But that's really the basis of the campaign, is to develop content with each of our partners. That's what we're focused on next. So for each of our partners, the hope is that we will develop at least one piece of content. So we're working with some of our partners right now to develop content. And the hope is that for the content, we post that on the Stop Ageism site, and then we push that out on our social channels. And then the hope is that each of the partners will post that piece of content on their individual sites and their social channels as well, so that we can have a wide audience and have the most people seeing the content as possible to hopefully make a difference over time. So yeah, that's the basis of, you know, the partners, what that looks like. There's a few other things that are happening with the campaign that we're really excited about. Right now we're just trying to get our feet underneath us. We're just trying to get moving. Like I said, getting the partners on board and trying to start develop content with each of them. So I've been working to do that right now, and would love for you to, you know, take some time to look on the website. So it's stopageism.org. If you'd like to go check it out for a bit. And if you are interested in joining the campaign, we would really love for you to be a part of it. Like I said, this is really partner-led. So it's really, we'd love to share content that you already have if you've been working in the ageism space already, or if you're new in this space, we'd love to get you involved to help make a difference. But yeah, definitely reach out. If you go to the Contact Us page on the Stop Ageism website, then there's an email address on there. If you would be willing to send an email, would love to get time set up to discuss and talk about the campaign. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's a very brief review of the campaign, just talking about where we're at right now. I would love for you to also go on our social channels to have a look and see the content so far, and see some of the things that we're up to. But yeah, really excited to really get this moving. So yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much for that overview. And I was struck by a few things there. One was sort of the three priorities that you set, the issues around language. And I think both the way you described that was really excellent, but also I know Tom and others have been really challenged by how some people describe older adults, but also the imagery as well. So again, I think we may want to come and have a debate about that, because again, the vibrancy of the images, and you mentioned photographers being part of this campaign. I think we don't just have to change the narrative, we also need to change some of this image. And I'm conscious that the conversations we've had before about, why is it our road signs show ageist approach when you go past a care home? I know Centre for Ageing Better have got a call out at the moment to say, can you come up with some funkier road signs? Well, those are just a token, let's really bed this in better. And I love the stuff you talked about, healthy cities and sort of age-friendly cities. That very much in tune with the work that Lynn and others are doing around thinking about healthy neighbourhoods and age-friendly approaches. And I think that again touches on some of the stuff that Sarah started off about, talking about the United Nations work. They've been fundamental in the charter there. So thanks ever so much, and I do encourage people to have a look at the website and sign up, and I hope that works well, and we look forward to partnering you along the road. So I'm going to sort of take a pause for a minute and just ask Lois, and have we got any chat? Have we got any burning questions that people have been asking in the chat box?
Hi there. I haven't got any sort of questions, but we've had a few comments from Rose Gilroy. I don't know if you wanted to share Rose. Any of the comments that you made, Rose. No pressure if not, but if you would like to, feel free to unmute yourself and sort of make any comments.
Hi everyone. I was just sort of jumping in on some of the points, thinking about what we're surely facing is institutional ageism, and we're not uncomfortable about using that in terms of racism, and I think we shouldn't be uncomfortable about talking about ageism that way as well, because I think it is institutional. We seem to, I'm sure we've all faced this as people researching on issues of age and indeed aging ourselves, that you get some steps forward on the debates, and then in COVID, what you get is this, I know it's been driving Tom absolutely nuts, is this kind of explosion of wrinkly hands and sort of disassociated body parts and things. This kind of sorry, I've had a complete Zoom day, so I'm losing the will to live. But we just keep reverting back to these kind of stereotypes, almost as if we learn nothing and reflect on nothing. And I think it just ends up being hugely irritating. So I was just expressing some general irritation about this, but I think it's great that we're having this event and we're trying to unpick this and maybe challenge a society on older people's day that we need to do something. Actually, I was just thinking the other day in some teaching prep, there's a nice guide from Joseph Rowntree Foundation to journalists about how should we talk about poverty. Thinking about what is the language, what are the images, trying to find some way of talking about this. And maybe this is something that we should be doing, is actually putting out a guide to journalists and to others. How do we talk about the aging process? How do we talk about people in later life, which is respectful and realistic?
Rose, that's great. And I think what you're saying really sort of exemplifies what Sarah was saying about how we sort of categorize people in the other. And perhaps imagery and narrative language it sort of fosters that as well. Sarah, any comments or thoughts?
I really loved Rose's view on this idea of institutional ageism. because I think in a way we've talked a lot about indirect ageism, and I think to a certain extent the majority of ageism is indirect, but actually it's because it's institutionalized. And I think you're right that we should start using that term more. So I thought that was a very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Tom, do you have any comments back on the narrative or the imagery, and Jordan as well? Because obviously that's something which is one of the key strands for you. So either of you have got any comments on that?
Well, I would, yeah, I could obviously talk for the rest of the evening about the way in which aging is represented. And it's interesting because I wouldn't have ever regarded myself as a researcher who did work on ageism. You know, I was doing work on environments of aging or on social relationships in later life on all sorts of topics. But one thing that COVID's really brought home is, you know, the fundamental challenge that we all face as in terms of aging societies is to just accept the demographic change and to not regard this as a terrible threat to society, but this is just something we have to come to terms with. And gerontology has been saying this for absolutely decades. You know, when Sarah and I and Rose started, you know, we didn't need to pursue this sort of research agenda because it was stuff we knew and people were doing it. But what COVID really shows is that sense of, you know, structural lag, is that, you know, older people who are living their lives and getting on with it and doing things, the society structures are just so far behind, caught up in some terrible time warp that doesn't reflect the world in which we live. And for me, you know, I'm moved by the images that are used to represent later life, and also by the language that's used in sort of media discourse to represent later life. But it's an easy target for a researcher to show the disconnect between the images that are used and the lived reality. You know, so those wrinkly hands are used indiscriminately to represent stories that have nothing to do with people's body parts and the wrinkles on their hands. And it's to do with, you know, the way in which older people are, in context of COVID, being systematically disadvantaged by a system that can't provide a decent test and trace service, that hasn't been able to support people who expect care, who expect home in care homes. You know, it's a really interesting set of words, the idea of a care home that can't care for people and can't be home for people. So I've sort of found myself drifting into this other type of agenda through social media in particular, but I'm now working with a number of colleagues on research projects that may allow us to analyze some of the images around aging, but also constructively think about how we can turn this around, how we can alter the editor's code in a way that discourages media organizations from using ageist language, using ageist imagery, but supports them in that, is to say, yes, you know, what's gone on in the past, let's draw a line under that and let's just do this so much better. Because, you know, we could criticize for years to come, but really we need to change minds. And that's why the Stop Ageism campaign, like other anti-ageism campaigns, is a really good idea. So I'd focus there on language as well as images, on cities as well as, you know, not just on cities, but all the places in which people live. And but, you know, yeah, it's a great campaign. It's an initiative that I'd really be supportive of.
That's great. Look, I just want to say, Jordan, is there anything you wanted to add to that? Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Yeah, I just wanted to, you mentioned the language portion, and I feel like it is a broader issue. It's about the way we communicate with one another. So you mentioned the road signs and what that looks like, Jeremy. And then we've been discussing, you know, languages and verbal language, and then also photography, the way that we use that, what that looks like, and the images that we use. So yeah, I think that the way that we communicate with one another, it is a broader issue than just, you know, words coming out of our mouths. So yeah, definitely agree. It's much broader than that.
I wanted to invite Jason to come in because I've been following a lot of the work that's happening in Manchester as well as Newcastle with Rose and the team there. But I'm conscious that Jason's posted something about a new paper that's come out today. Are you able to unmute yourself if you're still there?
Yeah, I can't. My camera's not working, but can you hear me?
Yeah, welcome.
Yeah. Well, Greater Manchester, they've launched with the Older People's Network has launched a photography competition, which was supposed to start before COVID and has had lots of different reiterations of thinking how to do that or not do that. But it was very important to the Older People's Network to do it. So together with GM Culture and Greater Manchester Aging Hub have launched that today. So it's a competition by older people for older people, but it's been something they've been talking about for quite a while. But it's also linked to the culture and creativity work that GM's been trying to do more of, and this Bearing's legacy of a creative agency or creative aging development agency also with the university and the museums, and GMCA was also launched today. So you'll be hearing more about that in days to come. So a lot of that is also trying to look at ageism in a different way. And also it is, I think, as Thomas said, around place, but not just the cities, but also all the places, neighborhoods that people live in, certainly for Manchester, Greater Manchester, the age-friendly principles and policies they've been trying to push through as much as possible and challenged during COVID, but still going forward.
Well, thank you for that, and we'll follow that with interest. And we know there's several really helpful tools that the forum has produced over the last 6 months as well during lockdown.
Yeah.
I also wanted to invite Lorraine to say a few words because she posted something about the Later Life Learning Network radio, and I know that Tom is a keen follower of this radio program. So, and I think you and I have both been interviewed by it as well. So, Lorraine, can I pass over to you from our Welsh family?
Yes. I don't know how much there is to say about the Later Life Learning Network, except that Mervyn, whom I've known through Better Government for Older People years ago, contacted me and said, would you like to talk about yourself and the work, how you've been involved with older people for a long time as a social gerontologist, but also now as an older person. And also it was about what was happening in Wales, because I was interviewed in April at a time when the care homes scandal was really at the height of its terribleness, I suppose. And we saw ageism in a different light, I think. We've always seen it, haven't we? It's just that it was there on our televisions every day. And comment I made in your chat, which relates to my conversation with Mervyn, was regards I'm talking with Mervyn now weekly or almost every 10 days, and with a group of other people, of which Jeremy you know a little about. We're calling ourselves the Tribe. It's a temporary name while we norm and storm, but we are really trying hard to create a narrative and a different concept which looks at totally deinstitutionalizing care. And I see housing and homes as absolutely crucial to that. It's very frustrating that so many good things happen, but so many public services just ignore all those good things. And maybe that conversation is now, because of COVID, has created an opportunity for us to really push ahead hard with this. So my call would be, thank you so much for this particular webinar. I've enjoyed everyone that's spoken, but my call is please join us and support us as we try and change probably one of the biggest things ever. I don't want to go in a care home. Is my sentence. You know, in 10, 15 years time, I will need support. You know, in 10 and 15 times, I will be nearer 90 than 85. And I own home with total control. So it's lovely to hear that from Guild Living, and great to hear what Tom was talking about in terms of what really is a home. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And also, what I was struck by, and I want to throw this open really to the panel, is that, you know, one of the things that Wales has done is got a commissioner for older people. And do you think, you know, that vested interest in terms of an institution, having talked about institutional ageism, is a way that actually gives voice to tackling ageism, having a commissioner? Would something like that in England work? Any we're
yet to see that we're yet to see the results, aren't we, of her campaign, because it only began last October.
Yeah.
I'm very surprised that the first commissioner didn't start that, because that has always been the biggest issue, ageism and age discrimination.
Yeah.
So don't wait for Wales to test it out and to change things. You must do it in England, and you must do it in Scotland, Northern Ireland.
Thank you for that. Any other comments from the panel? If not, just to say,
I'm happy to add something on because, you know, Sarah's talking very much about the human rights agenda for aging, and I would probably count myself as one of those people who's changed their view as a result of COVID. That historically I would have been broadly against a set, developing the UN framework on the rights of the older person, because I think it was tended to be done from an advocacy perspective rather than from a perspective that was based on, older people in some way being systematically denied their rights. But, you know, there's no other way of looking at what's happened with COVID across the world without thinking that older people have been seriously let down by the lack of support, by the way in which their rights to life have been ignored, have been reduced. And, and this aligns very much with some of the later work of Peter Townsend, as he was reflecting on the idea of structured dependency and the need for a human rights approach. And he was always ahead of his time, is what I would say. And, you know, I've come round to that way of thinking, having resisted, having worked with colleagues who've been involved in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which in some ways is problematic. But, you know, I do think we have to really take a radical step forward. And then to answer the question about the Commissioner for older people or the older person, I think we seriously need this type of independent advocate for older people in England and in other parts of the UK, and much stronger voice for older people, much stronger advocacy for older people.
It's interesting that you mentioned Peter Townsend, because obviously he also was one of the early architects for looking at different categorization of housing in later life. So part 1, part 2, part 3. But I think his approach was one of inclusivity rather than thinking as a special need. So again, I think that sort of mirrors what you're saying there as well. So that was very helpful. I'm conscious there are a couple of other questions, Lois. Anything that strikes out?
Can I come in with just what Tom said?
Yes, please do.
Because I'm exactly with you, Tom. I mean, I've had exactly the same reaction. So I think because my background is in, population studies, and I always saw aging about the aging of the population. And I think Tom talked a little bit about this as well. And I just sort of somehow thought that actually and I talk a lot about older adults, in other words, they're all adults, and we need protection that once we stop being children, then yes, that protection lasts until we die, regardless of age. But I think I'm becoming much more on what Tom is saying, is that it is very, very clear that in a way, those of us who thought we were addressing it in the right way, I think we were wrong. And I think we really do need, and now is the time actually to say, yeah, we've really got to focus on older people, because across the world they have been so let down. So I really do agree with what Tom said. I also think, so it was very interesting that Brexit has done many things to our country, but one of the things it did was actually stop the Cameron government from really pushing an age-friendly agenda forward. That, as you know, that there was this big review of aging, the Foresight Review, and many gerontologists, you know, and colleagues of Tom and mine were involved in it. And you know, David Cameron and Oliver Letwin really supported that agenda. And if it hadn't been for the referendum, then all sorts of things were put in place. And I think a commissioner for older people in every country probably would have come out of it. So there was goodwill once, and you know, we must remember that. And when we get through COVID and we get through whatever disruption is going to happen early next year, you know, I think it's worth revisiting that. So Tom, I'm with you on both of those.
That's great. Look, and you know, we're not about knocking social care or health. I think what we're really keen, and partly why we've sort of brought this HAPPI hour together, because HAPPI is the acronym for Housing and Aging Population, and looking at different approaches to that. And this is both in terms of being more care ready, as well as sort of showing the greater sort of support for independence across all our different housing settings that we need to achieve. And so again, I think some of the conversations we've had have really echoed that. I'm conscious that we're going to be calling last orders in a moment, so I'm just wondering if there are any other final questions that that you want to put to Sarah, Tom and Jordan, or if any of the panelists have any final points that they would like to get across.
I can't see any other questions coming through in the chat, Jeremy.
Okay. Well, look, I just wanted to, on that case, we may be able to finish a few minutes early. This has been a really illuminating.
Jeremy, I think Barbara's trying to make a point. Are you?
Oh, Barbara, hello there.
Oh, sorry, Barbara.
Sorry, Jerry, coming in rather late and with what might be quite an ill thought through point, but
no, I'm sure it's not.
This morning, we took our Doorbells project to a meeting in Sunderland, and Doorbells is a film that we've created, which is really partly a provocation to get people to think about their housing decisions and to plan for later life. So I just really wanted to comment that I was really struck by Tom's oneness description, because I think what I ended up feeling in this discussion group when people were talking was just how complex it is to decide what it is you do want to do in later life. And actually, some of us are desperately trying to get out there saying, oh, you could have an adaptation, or you could move to sheltered housing, or you could, you know, we're desperately wanting to find solutions. But actually, the complexity about where and how you live in later life is great and has so many dimensions. So I suppose I wanted to thank Tom, because I kind of, listening to you, I understood why it was so complex, and helped me to think differently about not wanting to push solutions at people, but more about creating the space in which older people can have conversations and think about where it is they want to live. And that's really what we try to do through our Doorbells project, is just create space for conversation.
Thanks very much for reminding me about that in particular. I've just posted on the chat the item that we covered for you a year or so back. So if anybody is interested, do go to that or go directly to your own pages. So that's really very helpful. There's a number of different projects that Lynn is pulling together to look at this. I mentioned the term collaborage that we sort of we've been coining of late. We're looking at different models of collaborative forms of housing and care, because we do believe that can help both build greater mutuality, help some of the resilience, provide a bit more self-care, supportive care, as well as the way we design our accommodation and homes to create both the belonging that Tom talked about, but the longing to live in those homes as well, and make those connections with our neighbours, our communities, our support networks and the like. And that's something that we will be promoting in the next month or so, and sharing a directory of different collaborative forms of housing with care, which I think is sort of underpinned by what we've been discussing this afternoon. So on behalf of the Housing LIN, but also on behalf of everybody who's joined us this afternoon, can we thank Sarah, Tom and Jordan for 3 excellent presentations. A virtual clap from me. If you're interested in joining the happy hour next week, we are looking at a toolkit that the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations produced with the University of Stirling and a series of OTs to look at different models of inclusive living and looking at the design perspectives and the like. This was a toolkit that was launched last week. It's on the Housing LIN Scottish pages, and we're really pleased to have our Scottish colleagues join us next week. So if you haven't signed up, you've still got time to do so. Thanks ever so for joining today. As Lois said at the outset, this has been recorded. We shall make it available along with the slides post today's session. And if you don't get our newsletter, we'll be publishing that tomorrow. But on behalf of the Housing LIN and all the speakers, thanks ever so much for a really excellent conversation. And I hope you can all drink up now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.